You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
Okay, last session we covered the period after the Civil War that became known as Reconstruction. This was a policy phrase that was coined by Abraham Lincoln. Now, the first major civil rights movement in the United States began with the Civil War. It ended with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes as president. Now, even though the South lost the war, the planter class recovered its economic and political might within 12 years following the conclusion of the violence. They ruled to this day. Now, despite passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution during and immediately after the Civil War, they gained their power. So the Compromise of 1877 that brought Rutherford B. Hayes to the presidency ensured that the South would continue apartheid policies until the civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s, and that civil rights movement will bring the racial codes to a standstill. Yet, as historian Alan Nevins writes, the year 1877 was one of the blackest in the nation's annals. So let's understand the Compromise of 1877, and we're going to go into what is known as the Gilded Age. And in this presentation, we will deal with the Gilded Age. So when we take a look at the economy in 1877, it was in its deathbed, and democracy was non-existent. Unemployment, bankruptcy, business failures, and severe depression encouraged violence. It created poverty, and it wrought despair. Now, the presidential election of 1876 was tainted by fraudulent vote counts, and the election of 1877 was thoroughly corrupted. Now, there was a journalist named Lewis Lapham who was writing in Harper's Magazine, and he summarized the year very well. A number of politicians had been murdered in the southern states for their disagreement with the policy of lynching Negroes, he would write. The Lincoln County War in New Mexico encouraged the random shooting of Mexicans. Mobs formed in the streets of San Francisco to beat to death the Yellow Peril as personified in Chinese laundrymen and shopkeepers. And so this was very important because in 1877, it was about compromise, crisis, and conflict. So let's understand 1877. There was a railroad strike in West Virginia, Lewis Lapham continues. A railroad strike in West Virginia that began in July became the first national strike in the country's history. 500,000 workers walking away from factories and mines everywhere between New Jersey and California. Strikers in Pittsburgh set fire to the property of the Pennsylvania Railroad, destroying 39 buildings, 104 engines, 46 passenger cars, and more than 1,200 freight cars. And this disturbance moved the president of the railroad, Tom Scott, to suggest that the strikers be given a rifle diet for a few days and see how they liked that kind of bread. The state militia and federal troops complied with the suggestion, killing more than 100 strikers in Maryland and Pennsylvania. So clearly, democracy was not the dream of perfection that was anticipated by immigrants coming to the shores of this nation. The violence and the hypocrisy of the era encouraged Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner to label the era the Gilded Age. The name refers to the process of gilding an object with a superficial layer of gold, and it's meant to make fun of ostentatious display while playing on the term Golden Age. Let's take a look at a film clip by a musician named Jay Lee as she sings a song dedicated to the railroad workers who struggled to survive in 1877. Let's go to that film clip.
Along the Chesapeake's great shore, the poor were living rotten as can be. Sewage ran into the streets, some could not afford to eat, and poverty was quickly expanding. Wages fell 25% with 3 million in unemployment, the bulk of the burden on the poor. No B&O was profit bound, the bosses cut the wages down, the workers wouldn't take it anymore. The year 1877, the day July 11th, B&O bosses came and said, "Yo, workers better listen up, another 10% was cut, you've got until the 16th to accept." It was lunchtime when the strike began, the brakeman and the fireman said, "I'm not gonna work for this low wage." They stopped their train at Camden Junction, wouldn't let the railroad function, and struck with a dream of better days. The strike then spread to Martinsburg, where a shutdown of the rails occurred, and workers were lined up along the track. Said, "We're not working for the boss no more, we're working for ourselves, the poor, and we are gonna take our wages back." The governor sending troops to stop it, protecting the railroad profit, but they were outnumbered by the crowd. So President Hayes sent troops to fight, shot a man and broke the strike, and strike breakers rolled those engines out. The strike began in Cumberland on the western end of Maryland. Governor Carroll sent the National Guard. They were set to board their train at the Camden station. On the 20th of July they would depart. That Baltimore evening, Big Sam told the streets were filled with people who knew the workers needed their support. The 5th and 6th Regiment were ordered by the government to get to Camden station and report. The 6th Regiment came out, met by rocks from all around. They charged with their guns all lowered down. They fired on the angry mob, pushed on through and marched along, with 10 lying dead upon the ground. The 5th Regiment advanced with speed, but right across Madison Street on Utah Street there stood a great surprise. Armed with sticks and rocks and more, the people of Baltimore were waiting for them under darkened skies. They clashed and soldiers charged ahead, rushing with their bayonets, injuring any in their way. And blood and smoke were in the air, resistance was everywhere, and Baltimore was rising from its chains. And women threw rocks and bricks from windows of apartments and fought with strength that many would admire. Indeed, it was a bloody night. The people held the bloody strike. The soldiers pushed and stabbed and fired. When they finally got to Camden Street, half the guard had mutinied and 15,000 people had turned out. They yelled and fought and cheered and clapped, burned railroad cars and tore up track and shut Camden Station down. Now stuck inside the station house was Governor Carroll himself, with Mayor Latrobe and a bunch of cops. They told President Hayes the news. He summoned up more federal troops to bring the insurrection to a stop. The crowd dispersed and soldiers came, but still they couldn't run the trains, though the crowd was no longer there. The strike had spread up west and north, from Baltimore to Pittsburgh. Rebellion was erupting everywhere. By August, the national strike was over, crushed by gangs of federal soldiers, with 100 people gone and dead. A government sworn to uphold change could have made a living wage, but gave the crowd the bullets instead. Governor Carroll served the boss, Baltimore taxes paid the cost, and the railroad barons thanked the president. And Baltimore life went back to normal, poverty, fear, and fruitless toil, destined to rise up once again. Now let it be forever known, no worker ever stood alone. There's hope inside the power of a union. So take a stand and join the fight. The same one fought that glorious night, July 20th, 1877.
So after the Civil War, the U.S. went on a protracted program of annihilation of native peoples west of the Mississippi. Now today we appreciate the wars that Hollywood gives us as wagon trains and railroads made their way west to tame, quote unquote, the savage wilderness. So movie stars like John Wayne or Kevin Costner, and of course you have to give equal opportunity to blacks, Will Smith, they have popularized the Wild West in the American imagination. This was civility versus savagery. The wilderness, it needs to be tamed by courageous people who move out there to tame the land. Now the U.S. military, the CIA, the National Security Council, they still use the concepts of taming the wild in their descriptions of policies that are designed to target enemies today. So we have such notions as Tomahawk missiles, or Apache helicopters, or Comanche drones. And of course, when the U.S. captured Osama bin Laden, it was called Operation Geronimo. So let's understand and appreciate something about Native peoples. Because as Native peoples faced elimination and removal, in the Native societies, a religious revitalization movement spread across the land. It was known by white people as the ghost dance. But for Native peoples, it was a religious revitalization movement. This dance, this spiritual dance, was a religious movement which was incorporated into numerous Native American belief systems. The ghost dance was first practiced amongst the Nevada Paiute in 1889. And this practice swept throughout much of the western United States, quickly reaching areas of California and Oklahoma. So as this dance that's called the ghost dance spread from its original source, Native American nations throughout the West began to synthesize selective aspects of the ritual with their own beliefs. And this process created change in both Native American societies in Native American societies that integrated it, and in the ritual itself. Now, the chief figure in the movement was the prophet of peace, his American name was Jack Wilson, but he was known as Wovoka amongst the Paiute. And Jack Wilson prophesied a peaceful end to white American expansion, but he preached the goals of clean living, of an honest life, and most important, cross-cultural cooperation by Native Americans. So the practice of the ghost dance was believed to have contributed to Lakota resistance. Let's visit a documentary that helps us appreciate this dance.
A message of hope spread across the Great Plains. It was called the Ghost Dance, a dance to restore the past when Indian nations were free.
Okay, so the Wounded Knee Massacre is what's going to happen after this dance. The Wounded Knee Massacre happened on December 29th, 1890, near Wounded Knee Creek on the Lakota Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. So let's put down the Wounded Knee Massacre. As the film clip reveals, on the day before, a detachment of the U.S. 7th Cavalry Regiment, commanded by Major Samuel M. Whitside, intercepted Spotted Elk's, or Bigfoot's, band of Minneconjou Lakota, and there were 38 Hunkpapa Lakota near Porcupine Butte, and he escorted them 5 miles westward to a place known as Wounded Knee Creek, and this is where they made camp. Now, the rest of the 7th Cavalry Regiment, they consisted entirely of recently arrived immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. They arrived led by a Colonel James Forsyth, and they surrounded the encampment supported by 4 Hotchkiss guns. On the morning of December 29th, the troops went into the camp to disarm the Lakota. One version of events claims that during the process of disarming the Lakota, A deaf tribesman named Black Coyote was reluctant to give up his rifle, claiming that he had paid a lot for it. So a scuffle occurs over Black Coyote's rifle, and this scuffle escalated and a shot was fired, which resulted in the 7th Cavalry just openly firing indiscriminately from all sides, killing men, women, and children, as well as some of their own fellow troopers. And those few Lakota warriors who still had weapons began shooting back at the attacking troopers, who quickly suppressed the Lakota fire. So the surviving Lakota fled, but the U.S. cavalry pursued and killed many who were unarmed. So that by the time it was over, at least 150 men, women, and children of the Lakota Sioux had been killed and 51 wounded. 4 men, 47 women and children, and some of them would die later. Some estimates placed the number of dead at 300. 25 troopers also died, and 39 were wounded. 6 of the wounded would also die. It is believed that many were the victims of friendly fire as the shooting took place at close range in chaotic conditions. So let's go back to the documentary on Wounded Knee, and let's learn what recruited immigrants to the U.S. Army recently arriving from Southern and Eastern Europe to America so courageously performed on behalf of this nation's national interest.
Morning broke after a sleepless night surrounded by soldiers. Hokwoju witnesses would later recall what happened next.
Bigfoot, who was sick, came up with a flag.
Okay, so that ends the history of the United States since 1865, the Gilded Age, Part 1.